Well, now, this is the new year St. Louis has been waiting for. Turn of the century, new millennium, everybody celebrated that. But '04, that's our year. 1804, Lewis and Clark head west into the Louisiana Territory. 1904, the World's Fair. And 2004, well, we're just getting started. We welcomed in the new year with a big party in Forest Park, and to help bring back a bit of the World's Fair, the organizers brought in the biggest Ferris wheel they could find. 2004 for St. Louis is like a year-long anniversary or birthday party, and this was like lighting the candles on the cake. But wait, we get presents too. At the Missouri History Museum, they've spent 7 years and $7 million putting together the National Lewis and Clark Bicentennial Exhibition. You will find here the telling of an amazing story and a collection of stuff that's never been seen before and may never be seen again in one place at one time, and it wasn't easy. This past summer, when the Lewis and Clark exhibit was still just a plan on paper and an empty room, hundreds of artifacts chosen to be part of the exhibit were beginning to arrive in another part of the museum. In this nondescript room, the shelves were filling up with rare, priceless, and irreplaceable pieces of American history. On this day, Exhibit Registrar Diane Malot is opening a crate from the North Dakota Historical Society. Among the artifacts lent to the exhibit is a Shoshone Foolish Dog Society headdress, a warrior's headdress. As of now, what happens to this prized object is her responsibility for the next few years.
You look at the object to make sure it's stable. When you pick it up, you have a nice clean area prepared for it to set it down. You don't want to have it in your hands and realize you don't have a place to put it. So you want to do that in advance. You look at the packing materials themselves to make sure little parts of it haven't fallen off during transit. If they have, you keep them. Maybe you can reattach them.
What you were looking at was a split-horn bonnet, which was the kind of headdress that a warrior would have worn in Lewis and Clark's day.
As the curator of the Bicentennial exhibit, Carolyn Gilman spent years scouring the country for just the right artifacts. Sometimes she knew what she wanted and where it was, but she had no idea that this headdress was in a museum in Bismarck, North Dakota.
And this was one of the things that we just happened across in their storeroom, and we realized that this was a very old style of headdress. When Lewis and Clark met a very prominent chief or a prominent warrior, he would have been wearing a split-horn bonnet like the one that we have in the exhibit.
There's horns, porcupine quills are wrapped around. I believe this is horsehair on the end of the horns. It's ermine skins, owl feathers that have been dyed with something. There's some wool and some glass beads.
The registrar goes through an extensive inspection and condition report, making sure that what they got is what they expected to get, and that it would be returned in as good or better condition. She will do this for all 450 artifacts. Elsewhere in the room, craftsmen are preparing the wires and the rods and ties that will mount each item securely, safely, and unobtrusively. As the opening day deadline approaches, the empty exhibit room begins to fill up with the custom-designed and built cabinets, backdrops, cases, lights. Everything, big and small, will have its place and its reason for being here. The exhibit planners knew that they wanted to use the headdress to help tell of the important moment when Meriwether Lewis and Shoshone Chief Cameahwait not only met, but exchanged clothing.
So we thought we would collect a lot of Indian clothing and a lot of Euro-American clothing and kind of compare them. So that's what we did. But when we had assembled all of those artifacts, and this headdress was one of the artifacts that we assembled, we realized that the artifacts were saying something to us. They were speaking to us, and they were saying to us, you haven't thought about this enough. We realized that the clothing was really symbolizing things. It was all deeply symbolic of the role of the warrior and the soldier in society.
It's just a week now before the opening of the exhibit, and all of the pieces are definitely not in place, but they're working practically around the clock to make it happen. There were still hundreds of things that had to be done. The Foolish Dog Society headdress on this day was ready to be mounted in its case. It's in a section called Dressed in Courage, and in the case there are two figures, the Shoshone chief in his ceremonial warrior garments, and Captain Lewis in his dress uniform, or his ceremonial warrior garments, both wearing feathers in their caps.
The concept of military heroism was one that Lewis instantly understood, and Camille Waite also understood. And they also understood that each of them used artifacts and articles of clothing to symbolize military heroism, and they used those articles of clothing to communicate their sameness to each other.
If an authentic 1804 military uniform exists, they simply couldn't find it. So they had a replica made, but that in itself took extensive research to get the details right, down to the buttons and the cuffs.
Which was more difficult, the Lewis uniform or the Indian uniform?
Well, they were both pretty difficult because what people don't realize about Indian dress is that it is also subject to style and to change and evolution. Indian dress changed during the 19th century just as much as Euro-American dress changed. And so you can't put an Indian of 1804 in a costume that an Indian of 1870 would have worn. It would look totally ridiculous to the people.
And people would know. Some people would know.
Some people would know.
So you're happy with what you've got
I
here?
love it. I love the whole thing. It looks so beautiful.
This is not the only place in the exhibit where the Indians and their stories stand side by side with the explorers. That's something that makes the 2004 telling of the story different than the one you would have gotten in 1904.
I didn't represent the Indian part of the story because I thought it was a politically correct thing to do. I did it because I thought it was the most interesting part of the story. I thought that the social and the cultural landscapes that Lewis and Clark had to traverse were just as dramatic and just as difficult and just as challenging as those geographical landscapes. And
because either one could have killed them.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was just as much danger, and there was just as much difficulty. The traversing of the cultural landscapes, I think, required a lot more brain power. They required less physical prowess and much more diplomatic and mental prowess in a way. But I tell you, this case that holds the Foolish Dog Society headdress is going to be one of the knockout cases. And it comes very close to a kind of pivotal turning point in the story that I hope people will be able to appreciate. Because I think that the moment when Lewis meets the Shoshone is the moment of maximum communication, maximum bridging of cultural boundaries. And that was the moment when the expedition really became the core of discovery. They really discovered what was making these other people tick. And they were able to communicate across those cultural divides.